And of course, one of the consequences of that is that most African countries are going to fail on the MDG targets that they embraced, that they endorsed. Now that's a serious issue also. That's a serious question. If things didn't work, one of the tasks of evaluation is to figuring out, why didn't they work? And did the things really not work anyway? Because somebody's also told us that there's a lot of quite positive data and quite positive achievement in a number of areas across the continent, which is often mentioned when the MDGs are discussed. So people don't like bad news, and I think that's another lesson for evaluators, all of us. How do we create a climate of opinion, or a climate of governance, or a climate of international debate, where people don't mind admitting that things haven't worked, but at least they say we have to learn from it. We have to draw lessons. We have to, what was wrong with this experience? If wrong is the word, or what could have been done better? One of the problems, I think, is we took the goals mechanically, and then some of the plans, especially like health and education, you say, well, if it's 50 per thousand by 2050, we'll just work back, and the trend we have to reach by 4.2% per year reduction. I mean, in the previous 10 years, your reduction may be 1.8%. You don't really explain how on earth you're going to go from 1.8 to 4.2. But some of the planning was extremely mechanical. And I think, so what did the MDGs do to planning, if planning is still alive in countries? For the first years of the decade, there was also duality between the poverty reduction strategies, which were being promoted by the Washington institutions and were promoted by the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and the MDGs, which were being promoted by the UN in New York and the Ministries of Planning. And a number of countries ended up with two separate plans. The MDG plan, which, if you were lucky, had the benediction of Jeffrey Sachs and a team of 30 or 40 experts who would fly in and spend 5 days telling you how to do it. Or you'd have PRS, which you would then use to get your HIPIC initiative through, and by about 2005, 6, 7, people were beginning to put together, so maybe the poverty strategy should be 5 years, not 3 years, and maybe we should put in the MDGs and so on. So we have to sort of manage with convenience at some point down the road. But I think one of the things about the whole MDG effort is that it does, in some ways, maybe, although the idea was to have a common and shared agenda, it has not done enough, maybe, to reduce the fragmentation in planning instruments and initiatives, in fact. Because the MDGs came and, in a sense, were superimposed upon existing plans and processes. They were very much based upon existing initiatives which had been launched by WHO, UNESCO, UNICEF, and so on in the previous decade. So there was a basis for some of those targets and goals, a number of targets and goals. But in practical terms, what really happened then? Were extra resources generated? Where good experience explained and analysed? And there have been good experiences. If you take the case of child mortality, I always talk about Niger, which reduced mortality by 4 or 5% a year, or in 2000-2010, article in Lancet that explains it. Senegal, we haven't got the article in Lancet yet, but we do pretty well also, even better if you believe the two surveys, and sometimes you can't believe the surveys, even better in reducing child mortality. But I think what characterizes a lot of the evaluative work that has gone on over this whole period has been measurement. I mean, people are bringing out wonderful documents. UNICEF have got a lovely thing on child mortality, for example. We know all about who's dying and where they're dying and how many are dying and which countries they're dying in and what are the trends, but we don't really know. And even the Lancet article on Niger is pretty tentative in its conclusions as to why the mortality rates have declined so much faster in that country compared with neighboring countries. So I think that we've been doing a lot of glorified bean counting. We've been trying to improve the measurement, and I think in some cases that's excellent. It's a good thing that there's better data, and we know where people are dying and how many, and where they're going to school and not, and so on. But ultimately, they're not answering some of the questions. And if you look at a lot of the literature around the MDGs, there's a lot of it beating the drum. We've got to get there, and some of the conclusions are of a most general nature, that if you have a participatory, inclusive, well-financed, government-friendly, donor-supported strategy, you're likely to do better. Well, these are sort of truisms which we don't need necessarily to perhaps keep on, but it's stopping there. So I think that we need to look at some of the ways that monitoring has been conducted, some of the ways that planning was conducted, both at national and sub-national levels. We need to take a look at where there were competing agendas. Where these agendas on the MDGs, agendas which you bring out every time you have a donor consultation, where there's something which were really anchored. If you look, I looked at Ghana. Ghana started out with a poverty reduction strategy. I mean, I'm sure they had other things too. They had a poverty reduction strategy. Then they went to a growth and poverty reduction strategy, and now they're on a Ghana shared growth and development agenda. So it goes to show that over the decade as well, there's been a shift in the language that's been used to describe some of the development efforts. So I think that I mentioned about the dynamics of the actors and so on. I think very often policy implementation and programmatic success is tied up with that. And very often it's a very sensitive area. My paper is called The Politics and the Partnerships. I mean, there's a lot of politics in all of this, about who's prepared to say what and tell which story and so on. And I think that at the end of the day, when the figures come out, and some countries will have seemed to have been better achievers than others, at least in some areas, there'll be a bit of a tendency to attribute that success to the fact that they were the MDGs, or we had an MDG plan. And it may well be that these were countries which would have got there anyway, and maybe would have got there faster if they didn't have to go to all these meetings and preach to the other countries. So we don't know, we don't have factual, and so I think that that is one thing which I wanted to raise. The other thing to look at is unintended consequences. What were the unintended consequences of the MDGs? The fact that there has been this attention. Is that the reason why we have no power at the Hilton Hotel? Is that the reason that governance and infrastructure and some of these other issues that people feel are so important have really not perhaps had, even agriculture, even employment, have not really had the same attention over the last 10, 15 years because there's been a bandwagon very much focused on child mortality and maternal and HIV/AIDS and water and sanitation and so on, which were in the MDGs.